Okay, putting in some pistons in a 318 Mopar. Go over some basic information. Um, Normally what I do is I'll put the bearings in the rod. I'll mic the crankshaft and I'll measure and set my dial bore gauge off the measurements of the crank journal, off the mic. So I'll carefully set this in after, of course, the bearings have been torqued up. And it's saying that we're at 2.5 to, I believe, 2 4/10. So that's pretty good. Of course, the rods have been reconditioned. ARP bolts, ARP lube on them. This is a mild build. Check the rings. Top ring is 18, second ring is 15. The oil rails have been checked, and there's plenty enough gap on them that they're not going to butt. You see a lot of guys that use rubber gloves, and that's fine. I get it. You know, guys don't want their hands in the stuff all day, but actually, if you wipe the parts down with your skin of your hand and your hand is clean, it'll actually lift some of the fuzz and dust off the parts. Okay, there's nothing fancy about these rings. They're pre-gapped ring set. Like I said, this is a mild build. When you get your rings, I always check the end gaps to make sure there's no burrs on them. And that's simply done by just taking the ring and squeezing it together and looking at it, making sure that it's like tight. Some of these Hastings rings in the past have had a little bit of a burr on them, so it's going to affect the end gap. So you want to be careful of that. These rings have been checked. Another thing is too is these things are always seems to be horribly dirty. These have been washed. They've been checked. I did this engine with a torque plate. Normally when it's in the machine, I check to make sure what I truly have for ring gap. So ring gap is good. Bearing clearance is good. Everything is pretty darn good. Okay, so this is our top ring. And there's going to be positions. If the ring isn't marked, dents or letters are always going to go to the top. If there's no dents or letters like this ring and there's no back cut on this ring, if it's a back cut bevel, it's going to go to the top if it's a top ring. If it's a second ring, the bevel is going to be on the bottom. But they're usually always marked. And this one says top. Obviously it says top, so that's a second ring. And if you get some iron rings and they're not marked for position and you get them mixed up, the sure way to check the second ring from the top ring is the bevel on the second ring is always going to be down and the top is going to be marked or dented with a little mark, sometimes a letter. So that's going to always tell you the orientation of the rings. And a top ring will either say top, and if it's a barrel ring like this one is, they call that a barrel face ring. It can go either way. It does not matter on the top ring. Some rings are not that way. So if the top ring's got a dent or a mark on it, you always put it to the top. Sometimes, if you can't see it very closely, I'll mark them with a little red marker. I got some little red paint marker. That helps. These are very clearly, you can see it. So, and I know, see, I'm going to spiral groove this, and a lot of people say don't ever spiral groove a ring. Hey, don't ever spiral ring a ring. I just did it. It's not a problem spiral grooving them in. You got to be careful. You take your time. You can spread the ring out with a ring tool. I've done this for a long time. If you want to listen to the ring manufacturer, don't spiral groove them. I spiral groove them. Never had a problem with anything. It's common sense. A little bit of that goes a long ways. Um, Another thing too is I'll run my thumb over the bearing surface. If, like I said, if your hands are clean, you're going to be able to pick up and feel more than with a rubber glove on. And I get it. I understand why guys are wearing rubber gloves. This stuff is, some of it's bad and you're into it all day. But when it comes to putting an engine together, I'll take my chances. Okay, now this has got a dent on it. The dent always goes to the forward part of the engine. This is 30 over. So that's pretty much it. I'm going to put this in. I'm going to move the camera so you can see me installing it. Okay, I've got a rod vise. If you don't have a rod vise, it's a good idea to get one. Don't clamp this in a vise. A rod vise is a whole different animal than a regular, ordinary vise. If you had some soft jaws on your vise, could you do that? Yes, you could. But you don't want to leave a bunch of marks inside the rod. I'll put a little bit more ARP lubricant on these threads after I take them off. Typically, the rod is checked, the rod is rebuilt. It's not uncommon for me to have the rod apart 3-4 times. So I always want to make sure that it's got enough lubricant on them, the threads. Okay. So I've got Joe Gibbs Assembly Lube grease. That's what I'm using. Okay, I'm going to put this crank in position all the way down. Going to wipe the crank down with my hand. I'm going to make sure there's nothing stuck to it. I'm sure there's some haters out there that got some comments for this, but you know, I've done a lot of engines and it's just a habit. If you don't like it, don't do it. But I always rub my hand down the bore and make sure there's no grit or nothing stuck on there. Like I said, you're not going to feel it with a rubber glove. Okay, I got this tool. If you don't have this tool, you can get some fuel line hose. That always worked. This is just a little bit more handier. Of course, you want to make sure it's clean. You know, you can never be too clean. And then I'll set the rod off to the side. Okay, so I got the piston and the rod off to the side, so that's holding the piston up in place. So I can figure out my ring and orientation. My two bottom oil groove, or my two end grooves for the oil rails are here. And my top ring is going to be here, and my second ring is going to be down. Now, I know I just put these rings in. You know, of course, you always want to check to make sure the rings are correct, and the rings are correct for this piston. You know, you can put the wrong rings in the wrong grooves, and you can have yourself a lot of problems. And then gap's important because you don't want it to butt when the engine gets hot. Okay, so my top ring's here, my second ring's there. My oil expander is going to be right there. My two end rail gaps are right here. So that piston is ready to go in the bore. You can see that you can see the butt mark on them. Sometimes I paint them red. If they're hard to see, you can see them better, which is a little red paint pen. Works really good. And some guys don't like this tool here. I've used it a lot. Over the years, it served me just fine. There's other tools for compressing rings. You know, if you are starting out, you know, I'd recommend one of these. Some guys like tapered sleeves. Them work all right, but honestly, I don't use them very much. I find them to be clumsy if you've got a head studded engine and you don't want to take the studs out. I like this better. But that's personal preference. You know, everybody's got their own opinion. Of course, you want to make sure that the arrow's to the bottom of the spring compressor. Okay, and you just want to squeeze it and make sure that the rings are all going through. If you squeeze it and it doesn't compress to the piston, you probably have an oil ring that popped out or something. You want to be very gentle with these. I see guys that beat these things in with a sledgehammer. It just isn't the case, you know. This ring band has got a little bit of a high spot right there. I just tapped it a little bit, gave it a little bit more squeeze. Now I just tap them in. And I'm looking down where the gap is. I'm looking down and I'm looking at the rings. So if something stops, I know that ring is the problem. And I walk across the piston. You don't want to side cock the piston too much, because if you side cock the piston too much, it won't go in as straight as it could, and you could have an issue with the ring catch on the taper. This chamfer edge, I should say, not a taper. Okay, and then you just bring it down, just like that. Should be no more, should be no less. It should be exactly like that. If you gotta slam them through, you do that, you risk the chance of chipping the ring. And if you put any Napier oil rings in, you can chip them really easy, not even turning into a gorilla with them. So you really want to be careful with that. Okay, that piston's in. Wipe the cap off. When I put the bearings in, I wipe them down with lacquer thinner. I wipe the housing board down with lacquer thinner. I wipe the back of the bearing off with lacquer thinner. And I put a little Joe Gibbs assembly grease on them. Like I said, these rods have been reconditioned. I reconditioned them. So, you know, they've been washed and cleaned, but it still don't hurt to go over them with some lacquer thinner and make sure you get all your grit that you might have incurred when you reconditioned them. The rods will get like washed probably 3-4 times before they'll actually even get to the part where I hang them on the pistons. Okay, this is a radius. It's got a chamfer on it. You know, this is going to ride in the radius of the crank. This usually goes to the front on number 1, and the opposite will be for that side, which would be number 2. And the arrow dictates on the piston. Usually it'll have a letter to the front or an arrow, and that'll signify that it goes to the forward towards the front of the engine. Unless it's a reverse rotation engine, then all arrows usually go on the pistons backwards. That's just the way it is. It's running backwards. The thrust load on the pin is different. Usually when they're marked like that, there's a offset pin, a little bit of pin offset on them. Okay, so I'm not going to torque this rod up. I'll torque them all when I get them all in. I'm just snugging it up a little bit. I wipe the cylinder walls down with lacquer thinner. I do that until the towel comes up clean. Then I'll put a little oil on a paper towel. Then I'll wipe them out with oil. That's already been done to this engine. So that's just one of the steps. Okay, so now I'm set to do position 3. The crank's all the way down. Cylinder wall is cleaned out. I'll check the rings for this hole, and I'll continue doing that position. I'll check these visually. It's pretty obvious, these things, if they're buttoned or not. you can be from 16 thousandths end clearance on these things to damn near 60 thousandths, and you're not going to get yourself in too much trouble. You'll get in more trouble if these things decide to butt. So we're just checking them to make sure they're not going to butt. Okay, I'm going to grab position number 3. So what I normally do, of course, this has got wrist pin locks, and we want to make sure that them are completely seated. They have been checked. I'll check them visually, and they are in the groove. So I'll put my thumb on the oil expander rail, and I'll just take it. And I know that when this is to the front, these two are going to be to the back. I keep my thumb pressed on that so it doesn't pop out. Sometimes on the smaller oil rails, they can be a bugger. So that's pretty much set to go. And then I'll just clock it because we're already there. So we know that it goes like this. Okay. Another thing is if you're questioning whether the rods are on right, there's an oil squirter right there. And actually that takes the oil and it slings it up towards the camshaft. A very good idea. A lot of engines did this back in the early days. They've gotten away from that. But there's probably a good reason to probably go back to this on some engines. It allows oil to get up on the camshaft, which usually in most cases a little extra lubricant doesn't really hurt anything. Okay, I'm going to check my end gap because I'm going to go through and check every single one. Now this is a tapered feeler gauge. This is going to tell me the end gap fairly close. It's not 100%, but it gets close enough, and I verify it with a standard feeler gauge so I know what the difference is in the measurements between the two. And this is a little quicker. And it's got graduations on it, so I just tap it down. And I look at my graduations, and that'll tell me if the ring's in there square enough to get a measurement off of it. Okay, this is reading the same as the other one. So I know that this end gap is plenty okay for a second ring. I'm not going to get into why some guys open the second ring up more than the top ring. I mean, everybody's got their own opinion on that. This is basically an OEM engine. I do different things, but we're not going to get into that today. I guess if somebody wanted to really know my feeling on that, I'd happily tell them, but this is just showing how pistons are getting installed into an engine. That's how I do it. Like I said, everybody's got their own deal. This is just general information for somebody that's curious, you know, on the internet, that's looking for some information maybe and thinking about getting into building engines. This is just stuff that I've learned over the years. Okay, now I know this one's plenty fine. The top ring it's more than adequate for what the performance level. There's no power boosters, nothing of that. It's just a 2-barrel engine, so it's not a race engine, you know. And you know, we put race engines together like race engines, and we put street engines together like street engines. And some things I'll change the clearances on them a little bit sometimes, but most of the time we're just using an old OEM conventional ring pack, nothing special. So I'm going to put that one in just like I did this one. I like to keep these videos short. I don't like to leave them drag on. It's pretty much me putting the first one in is going to be like putting all the rest of the 7 in. So I just thought I'd make this little video. You know, of course, another thing is when you put the pistons in, you always want to make sure that they're somewhat center. If you got something like that, you got to figure out what you got going on. Could be the rods on wrong. You don't ever want them like that. Typically, in a perfect world, you want them in the center of the piston. On a conventional engine, unless it's a rod, some engines are actually piston guided. Actually holds the piston rod from moving, and then there'll be very little clearance there. But you still want to make sure that it's not rubbing side to side. And most of the older engines, you're not going to have to worry about the newer technology. So that's kind of the deal on the 318. That's it.